In the fall of 1961, 6 weeks after my father's funeral, the county clerk read out what he had left me: 200 fence posts, cedar and pine both, split clean through by 3 winters of frost, stacked crooked behind the milk house like nobody had ever meant to use them again. My brothers got the tractor, the equipment shed, and the 80 acres of bottomland that still grew corn taller than a man. They signed for it that same afternoon, and did not bother to lower their voices when they laughed about it in the truck. Everyone at that table agreed the old man had left me a pile of kindling, dressed up as an inheritance. It took me until the following May to understand what he had actually given me. My name is Della Rourke, and I was 23 years old that fall, widowed of a husband I'd had for less than 4 years, and childless in a county that measured a woman's worth in sons. My father had raised me on that same worthless quarter section before I married off it, and when I came back with nothing but a suitcase and a coat too thin for November, my brothers assumed I had come home to be looked after. Everett, the oldest, walked me out behind the milk house himself to show me my share, like he was doing me some kindness by not making me guess. He put his boot up on the stack and told me the posts were split beyond using, that no fence built from them would hold a calf through one bad wind, let alone a Kansas winter. He expected to have me boarded with our aunt in town by Christmas, the land sold off in pieces by spring, and the posts hauled to the burn pile before anyone had to look at them again. Nobody in that family thought I would still be standing on that ground when the snow melted, and nobody thought to ask why our father, a man who wasted nothing in 61 years of living, would leave his only daughter 6,000 pounds of broken wood on purpose. I want to tell you plainly, before anything else, that I did not know what I was looking at either. I was not raised to read wood the way my father read it, though I had watched him do it my whole childhood without understanding a single thing he was seeing. He would run his thumb down a post before he said it, slow, like he was reading a letter written in a language only he knew, and I used to think it was just a habit old men got into, the way some men chewed a matchstick or hummed while they worked. I did not think about it again until the lawyer, a thin man named Coyle, who had known my father since before I was born, held me back after my brothers had gone and pressed an envelope into my hand that he said Daddy had left with strict instructions not to open until I asked him myself what the posts were for. I did not ask that day. I was too tired, too raw, too embarrassed, standing in a stripped farmhouse kitchen while my own family divided up a life in under an hour. I put the envelope in my coat pocket and did not take it out again for 11 days, and when I finally did, sitting alone on the milk house step with the posts stacked crooked in front of me like a question nobody had thought to answer honestly, all it said in my father's cramped hand was one line: "Count them twice before you burn a single one." Count them twice before you burn a single one. I sat with that line until the light went out of the sky and the cold came up through the wood of the step and into my bones, and I did not understand it. Not that night, and not for weeks after. What I understood in the plain animal way a person understands hunger or cold was that I had nowhere else to go, and a stack of ruined fencing that was, as far as the entire county was concerned, worth exactly nothing. Aunt Ruth wrote within the month offering me a room and a job at her dry goods counter, and I wrote back and told her I needed until spring to decide, which was a lie meant to buy time I did not yet know what to do with. I slept those first weeks in my father's old bed with his coat over the quilt because the house had no other blankets left in it, and every morning I walked out to the milk house and looked at that stack of 200 posts, split and gray and useless looking in the frost, and I counted them. Twice, like he said. 206 the second time, which did not match the first count, and that was the first thing that told me my father had not left me kindling at all. He had left me a puzzle, and I did not yet have the first piece of what it was asking me to solve. The county called it Rourke's Folly before I'd even unpacked my second bag, and I heard it first from the boy who delivered the mail, who said it the way children say things they've heard adults say without knowing they're being cruel. Folly was generous, if I'm honest. Most of the men who stopped by that winter, ostensibly to see if I needed help hauling water or splitting kindling of my own, spent most of their visit looking at that stack of 206 posts behind the milk house and shaking their heads like they were witnessing a small tragedy they were powerless to prevent. Hollis Dieber who ran the feed store and had known my father since they were boys fishing the same creek, told me flat out over coffee that no fence built from split cedar would survive a Kansas wind, that the wood would splinter at the first hard gust, and I'd be out there every week of my life patching a line that wouldn't hold water, let alone livestock. I did not argue with him. I had no argument to make. All I had was a line of handwriting and a number that would not sit still in my memory, 200, then 206, then when I counted a third time on a Sunday afternoon with nothing better to do, 204, the posts were not moving. I want to be clear about that because for a while I suspected my own mind more than I suspected the wood. I had lost a husband and a father inside of 2 years, and grief does peculiar things to a person's attention, makes numbers slip and doors seem to open on their own, and letters arrive that a person swears they've already read. But I went out with a lantern one evening in December, when the cold had a bite that made the air feel solid, and I counted with my finger touching each post as I said the number aloud, the way my father used to make me count feed sacks as a girl so I couldn't cheat myself with a glance. 205. I stood there in the lantern light with my breath fogging in front of me, and understood, finally, with the kind of certainty that settles into the stomach before it reaches the head, that the number was not wrong. The stack itself was different by the day, and nothing about a stack of dead wood should behave that way unless somebody, or something, was moving it. I did not sleep well that night, not from fear exactly, but from the particular unrest of a mind that has just been handed a fact it cannot yet explain, and cannot set down either. By the second week of January, I had taken to sitting up past midnight with the kitchen lamp turned low, not from restlessness so much as from a kind of vigil I couldn't fully justify to myself. The farmhouse groaned the way old houses do in deep cold, settling and cracking, and more than once I convinced myself the sounds were nothing, just wood shrinking away from its nails the way it had every winter of my childhood. But on the 9th night, close enough to 1 in the morning that the fire had burned down to coals, I heard something that was not the house. It was a dragging sound, low and deliberate, coming from the direction of the milk house, and I sat frozen at the kitchen table with my hand on the lamp for what felt like a full minute before I found the nerve to stand. I did not have a gun in the house, my father having sold his shotgun to pay for the doctor the year his lungs went bad, so I took the fire poker instead, which in hindsight would have done little good against anything more determined than a raccoon, and I went out into a night so cold the snow squeaked under my boots like it was complaining. The milk house door stood open a crack, which I was certain I had shut that afternoon, and inside, by the thin light of my lamp, I found not an animal and not a thief, but evidence. 2 posts pulled from the stack and laid across a pair of sawhorses my father must have kept for exactly this purpose, along with a hand plane, rusted at the hinge but recently oiled at the blade, sitting on the workbench like someone had set it down mid-task and meant to come back. I stood there a long while in that cold little building that smelled of old milk and cedar shavings, turning the plane over in my hands, and I understood that whatever my father had been doing out here, he had not finished it. Somebody, before he died, had been coming back to this milk house again and again, working these ruined-looking posts by lamplight, and stopping short of whatever the work was meant to become. I did not tell my brothers about the milk house, not that winter, and not for a long time after, because I understood without needing to be told twice that whatever I had stumbled onto was mine to understand before it became theirs to laugh about. Instead, I went back to Coyle's office in town, the lawyer with the thin frame and the patient eyes, and asked him plainly what else my father had said before he died, beyond the line about counting. Coyle was quiet a moment, the way careful men are quiet when they're deciding how much of a promise they can keep and still be honest, and then he told me that my father had come to see him not once but 4 times in his final year, each visit shorter than the last, as the illness in his chest took more of his breath, and that each time he had asked Coyle the same question, had the letter come yet? Coyle did not know what letter, and my father would not say, only that it was coming, that it had to come before the ground froze hard enough to matter, and that when it did, Coyle was to make sure I understood the posts were not to be burned under any circumstance, not for firewood, not for spite, not even if I was starving and had nothing else to feed a stove. I asked Coyle if any letter had in fact arrived. He said he did not know, that my father's mail had gone straight to the farmhouse in those last months, not through his office, and that if there was an answer, it would be sitting somewhere in that house, unopened, waiting on a woman who had not yet thought to look for it. I drove home that afternoon faster than the roads allowed, my mind turning over every drawer and cupboard I had already gone through without truly searching, and I understood that I had been so busy grieving my father's absence that I had never once gone looking for what he might have left behind on purpose. The search took me 3 days, most of them spent on my knees in the pantry and the root cellar, pulling out jars of preserves my mother had put up before she died, and finding nothing behind them but dust and mouse droppings, and the particular disappointment of an empty space where you had hoped for something. It was my father's desk that finally gave it up, though not in any drawer, because I had already been through every drawer twice. It was under the desk, in a shallow compartment built into the underside of the writing surface itself, the kind of hiding place a careful man builds when he does not trust locks, only distance and the ordinary laziness of anyone who might come looking. Inside was a single envelope, postmarked from a land office in the county seat, dated the March before he died, and unopened. My hands were not steady when I broke the seal. Inside was a letter from a surveyor my father had apparently hired the year before, confirming what he had asked to be confirmed: that the eastern boundary of our land, the line that ran along the dry creek bed and had been assumed correct for 3 generations, was in fact drawn wrong by nearly 40 feet, and that the true line, the one recorded in the original 1889 township survey and never corrected since, put an additional strip of ground squarely inside our property that had been fenced, used, and taxed by our neighbor Aldous Penny for over 20 years. 40 feet does not sound like much, said aloud in a kitchen, but a boundary line, corrected, running the full length of our property, was closer to 3 acres of ground nobody in my family had ever known we owned, and buried at its center, according to a second page I nearly missed in my haste, was the old dry well that Aldous Penny had capped over a decade earlier and quietly forgotten. A dry well capped over means nothing to most people, and it meant very little to me either, that first night, sitting at the kitchen table with the surveyor's letter trembling slightly in my hands from the cold and from something closer to disbelief. I knew the well existed only because my father had mentioned it once when I was a girl, in passing, the way a man mentions a place he has decided not to think about anymore. He had said, if I recalled it right, that the well had gone bad sometime before I was born, sulfurous and undrinkable, and that Penny had capped it because a dry well on open pasture was a good way to lose a calf's leg, or worse. What the letter did not explain, and what I would not understand for another 2 months, was why my father had spent his final year of failing health hiring a surveyor to reopen a boundary dispute over 3 acres of pasture and a ruined well, instead of resting the way any dying man had a right to. I brought the letter to Coyle the next morning, and I watched something shift in his face as he read it, a carefulness come into his expression that had not been there before, and he told me, choosing his words the way a man chooses stones to cross a creek, that a corrected boundary of that nature was not a simple thing to file, that Aldous Penny had grazed that ground and paid taxes on it for over 2 decades and would not surrender it without a fight. And that fights over land in this county had a way of getting ugly fast, especially when the person bringing the claim was a young widow with no husband, no brothers willing to stand behind her, and a stack of ruined fence posts that the whole county had already decided told you everything you needed to know about her prospects. I asked him if the claim was valid. He said the survey looked sound to him, that the original 1889 marker was still findable if a person knew where to dig, and that if I wanted to pursue it, I would need exactly what my father had apparently been trying to give me all along, which was proof solid enough that no judge in the county could wave it away as an old woman's fading memory or a dead man's confused paperwork. I want to be honest and say that for a week after that conversation, I did nothing at all, because the size of what I was being asked to take on had a way of making a person sit very still. I was 23, I had buried a husband and a father in under 2 years, I had 200 and some fence posts that would not stay the same number twice, and I was now being told that my inheritance might also include a legal fight against a neighbor twice my age, who had the whole county's sympathy, and, more practically, the money to hire a lawyer sharper than Coyle if it came to that. It was my Aunt Ruth, of all people, who moved me off that stillness, though not on purpose. She wrote again in late January, pressing me harder about the room above the dry goods store, and included in her letter, almost as an afterthought, a line about how Aldous Penny had been in the store the week before buying rope and had made some joke to the clerk about the Rourke girl freezing herself out on that worthless quarter section, and how everyone in the store had laughed along with him. I read that line standing at my own kitchen window with the fields gone white outside, and something in me that had been grieving quietly for 2 years turned, without any drama to it, into something harder and steadier. I did not decide to fight Aldous Penny out of anger exactly. I decided, because I understood, reading that letter, that my father had spent the last breath of his strength trying to hand me a weapon, and that letting it sit unused in a desk drawer because I was frightened of a neighbor's opinion would be its own kind of disrespect to a man who had never in his life backed down from a fair fight over what belonged to him. I wrote back to Ruth that I would not be needing the room after all, and then I went out to the milk house with a lantern and my father's old hand plane and looked at those 200 posts differently than I ever had before, not as kindling anyone had left me by mistake, but as the first tool in a job I did not yet fully understand. Finding the original 1889 survey marker took me the better part of 3 weeks, working alone in weather that had no business letting a person outside for more than an hour at a stretch. Coyle had given me what description existed in the county records: iron stake sunk at the northeast corner of what was then called the Halloran parcel, 40 rods from a bur oak that may or may not still be standing 60 years later. I walked that fence line so many times I began to know every rise and hollow of it by the feel of my boots before my eyes caught up, and I found the oak on the 11th day, an old scarred giant with a lightning burn down one side that had somehow survived when lesser trees around it had not. The stake itself took another week, buried under decades of soil and grass roots, and I found it only because I had brought my father's old iron probe, the one he'd used for finding fence corners his whole life, and struck metal on a Tuesday afternoon with the light already starting to fail. I dug it out with my bare hands in the end, too impatient to fetch a shovel from the wagon 50 yards off, and knelt there in the frozen dirt with that rusted iron stake in my palms, feeling something close to what I imagine prayer feels like for people who still have the habit of it. The stake alone would not win an argument with a judge, Coyle had warned me, not without a licensed surveyor to certify the find and rerun the line properly, which meant money I did not have and a process that would take the better part of the coming season. But I had it. I had proof, cold and physical and undeniable, that the boundary my family had lived beside their whole lives without questioning was not where anyone believed it to be, and I carried that stake home wrapped in my coat like it was something living, and I set it on the kitchen table where I could see it every morning while I decided what to do next. It was Hollis Deaver, unlikely as it sounds, who gave me my next real piece of ground to stand on, though he had no idea he was doing it at the time. I had gone into the feed store in February for nails and found myself, not for the first time, on the receiving end of his gentle, well-meant pity, the kind that assumes a woman alone is a problem waiting to be solved by someone else's charity. But in the course of making conversation, while he counted out my change, he mentioned that his own father had surveyed part of this county back before the war, doing informal work for farmers who couldn't afford the county rate, and that he still had a trunk of his father's old field notes up in the store's attic that nobody had ever had reason to go through. I asked, as evenly as I could manage, whether Halloran's parcel might be in there. Hollis didn't know, but he let me climb up and look, mostly I think because he could not think of a polite way to refuse a grieving widow, a favor that cost him nothing but attic space. I spent 4 hours up there in the cold and the dust, sneezing over ledgers gone soft with damp, and found, near the bottom of the trunk, a set of hand-drawn field notes from 1889, with a signature I recognized from the county records as the same surveyor who had set the original marker, notes that included a rough sketch of the boundary and a note in the margin, half illegible, about a well already dry at the time of the survey and excluded from the penny grant, specifically because it sat, even then, on the Halloran side of the corrected line. I sat on that attic floor with dust in my throat and my heart going hard enough that I could hear it, because this was not just confirmation. This was a second, independent hand, 60 years dead, agreeing with my father's surveyor about exactly where that line belonged, and agreeing, more specifically, that the well itself, whatever it was worth, had never rightfully belonged to Aldous Penny at all. Spring came slow that year, the way it does on the plains when winter seems determined to argue past its welcome, and it was not until the first week of April, with the ground finally soft enough to dig without breaking a spade, that I found the nerve to go out to that capped well myself. I had put off the visit longer than I could fully explain even to myself, some part of me understanding, I think, that once I opened that cap I could not go back to a version of my life where the answer was still unknown. Aldous Penny's cap was nothing more than a few boards laid over the opening and weighted down with fieldstone, no different from 100 other capped wells scattered across the county's abandoned corners, and it took me less than 20 minutes with a pry bar to have it cleared. The smell that came up was exactly as my father had described it decades before, sulphurous and old, the smell of water that had gone bad and been left to sit in the dark. I did not climb down that first day. I was not fool enough to lower myself into a shaft that had been sealed for over a decade without knowing what waited at the bottom, so instead I lowered my father's old lantern on a length of rope and leaned over the edge, and what the light caught, 40 feet down, was not water at all but a dry stone floor and, propped against the curved wall, something rectangular and man-made that did not belong in any well I had ever heard described. I stayed there on my knees in the wet spring grass until the light started to fail, turning the lantern slow circles to see every angle I could manage, and I understood that whatever my father had spent his final year fighting to reclaim, it was not 3 acres of pasture at all. The pasture was only ever the argument that would let him get a body, any body, standing at the bottom of that well with a legal right to be there. It took me 2 more days to work up the courage and the practical means to go down into that well myself, days spent rigging a proper harness out of old plow harness leather and testing the rope against the weight of a feed sack before I trusted it with my own body. I asked no one for help, partly out of pride and partly because I did not yet know who in that county I could trust with what I suspected I might find. I went down on a Thursday morning with the sun barely up, my father's lantern strapped to my chest and my heart beating so hard I could feel it in my ears over the creak of the rope, and the descent felt longer than 40 feet has any right to feel, the stone walls sliding past slow and green with old moss gone dry and brittle. When my boots finally touched the floor, I stood there a long moment just breathing, adjusting to a cold that was different from the cold above ground, older somehow, and then I turned the lantern toward the rectangular shape I had seen from above and found a metal document box, the kind banks used to issue for safekeeping deeds and war bonds, rusted at the corners but its lid still sealed tight by a lock that had not given way to 12 years of damp. Beside it, wrapped in oilcloth gone stiff with age, was a second, smaller bundle that I did not open there in that cold shaft, some instinct telling me this was not a discovery to make by lantern light 40 feet underground, with my legs already shaking from the climb down. I looped both items into the sack I had brought and signaled to be hauled back up, and the climb out felt shorter than the climb in, the way returning always does, and when I finally stood again in the April sunlight with grass under my boots and that box heavy in my arms, I understood I was holding whatever my father had died still fighting for. The lock took a hacksaw and the better part of an hour at my kitchen table, my hands unsteady enough that I nicked myself twice, and barely noticed the sting. Inside the box, protected from the damp by a second layer of oilcloth my father must have added himself some time before he sealed it away, was a stack of papers that told a story I had never once heard in 23 years of being his daughter. There were deeds, old ones, predating even the 1889 survey, establishing that the Halloran parcel, before it was ever a Halloran parcel, had been homesteaded by my father's own grandfather, a man I knew only as a name carved on a headstone in the county cemetery. There were letters, a dozen of them at least, between my great-grandfather and a mining assay office in Wichita, dated across a span of 18 months in the late 1880s, discussing samples taken from a vein of ground my great-grandfather described only as the low corner near the creek. And there was a final letter, the ink faded nearly to nothing but still legible if I held it close to the window, confirming that the assay office had tested ore from that vein and found it carrying silver in quantities the writer called, in the careful understated language of a man who did not want the news traveling further than it needed to, worth further investigation. My great-grandfather had died the following winter of a fever, before any further investigation happened, and the knowledge of that vein, whatever had become of it, had apparently gone into the ground with him, remembered only in fragments passed down, until it reached my father as a story he half believed and had spent his final months trying to prove was true. The smaller bundle, the one wrapped in oilcloth, that I had not opened at the bottom of the well, turned out to be the most carefully preserved item of all, and when I finally unwrapped it that evening by lamplight, my hands were shaking badly enough that I had to set it down twice before I could finish. Inside was a leather-bound ledger, my father's handwriting filling perhaps 2/3 of its pages, dated across the final 18 months of his life, and reading it was like sitting across the table from him one last time, hearing his voice in a way I had not expected ever to hear it again. He had written down everything, his suspicion, inherited from his own father in fragments over a lifetime, that the old dry well sat near or directly above the vein his grandfather had once held. His decision, after his diagnosis, left him with a clear sense of how little time remained to hire the surveyor rather than simply walk onto Penny's land and start digging, because a man dying of a bad chest still had enough pride left to want to do a thing honestly rather than desperately. His growing certainty, page by page, that he would not live to finish the legal fight himself, and his decision, made sometime in the ledger's final third, to leave the proof scattered deliberately rather than assembled, the survey letter in the desk, the field notes he hoped I might stumble toward through Hollis, the box and ledger sealed in the one place he was certain Aldous Penny would never think to look twice, because Penny himself had capped that well and considered the matter closed. The last entry, dated 3 days before he died, was short. It said only that he trusted me to be more patient than my brothers, and that patience, more than any lawyer or judge, was the thing that would eventually make this right. I did not run to Coyle's office the next morning waving that ledger like a woman who had won an argument, though I wanted to, badly, in a way that surprised me with its heat. Instead, I sat with everything spread across my kitchen table for the better part of a week, reading my father's words over and over until I understood not just what he had found, but what he had wanted me to do with it. And slowly I began to see the shape of the 200 fence posts differently than I had at any point since the funeral. My father had not left me kindling, and he had not, I came to realize, even meant the posts primarily as a weapon for the boundary fight, though they would serve that purpose too. He had left me the posts because a claim to disputed ground meant nothing in this county unless a person could show they intended to use it, to work it, to fence it, and hold it the way land had always been held out here, by labor rather than by paper alone. A survey and a ledger might win a courtroom, but they would not stop Aldous Penny's cattle from wandering back onto that 3 acres the moment the legal dust settled, and they would not convince a county full of neighbors, who would sit on any jury Coyle managed to seat, that a young widow alone had any real claim to ground she could not be seen defending with her own hands. So I began, in the last cold week of April, to split those 200 and some posts properly, the way my father's handplane and worn whetstone had clearly been teaching me to do all along without my understanding the lesson, squaring the frost-cracked wood down to sound lengths, discarding what could not be saved, and setting aside what could. It was slow, blistering, humbling work, and more than once Hollis Deaver drove past on the county road and slowed his truck to watch me at it with an expression I could not quite read, somewhere between pity and the first faint stirrings of doubt. The work of setting a fence line by hand is not glamorous, and I will not pretend it was, out there alone through the first weeks of May, with a post-hole digger that blistered my palms raw before the first day was through, and a mallet I had to swing left-handed some afternoons just to spare my right arm the ache. I set the corner posts first, sinking them deep the way my father had taught me as a girl, without my ever expecting to need the knowledge, tamping the earth back around each one in layers, testing it with my full weight before moving to the next. Word travels fast in a small county, faster than any newspaper, and by the second week people had begun finding reasons to drive the road past our property that had never had reason to before. Some came out of simple curiosity, the kind that wants to see a spectacle up close before deciding what to make of it. A few stopped their trucks and offered half-hearted help I mostly declined, not out of pride exactly, but because I had come to feel, somewhere in the ache of my own shoulders, that this fence needed to be built by the hands it was left to. Aldous Penny himself rode the boundary once, on horseback, in the third week, and sat there for a long while at a distance watching me work without saying a word, his face unreadable beneath his hat brim, and then turned his horse and rode back toward his own house, without ever crossing onto what the old survey said was rightfully mine. I did not know, watching him go, whether that silence meant he already suspected what I had found in the well, or whether it meant nothing at all beyond an old man's discomfort at watching a young widow do a job he assumed was beyond her. Either way, the fence kept rising, post by post, and something in me rose with it that had nothing to do with wood or wire. Coyle filed the boundary correction in the second week of May, once I had finally brought him everything: the survey letter, Hollis's father's field notes, the deeds and assay letters from the box, and my own father's ledger, and he told me plainly that he had never, in his years of practice, seen a claim arrive so thoroughly documented, that most boundary disputes in this county were settled on memory and bluster, and whoever could afford to outlast the other in court, not on 3 independent sources of evidence spanning 60 years. Aldous Penny predictably contested it, though Coyle said his lawyer's letter read less like a confident denial and more like a man going through motions he no longer believed in, and I understood, reading between Coyle's careful phrasing, that Penny had likely known for years the line was wrong and had simply counted on nobody ever caring enough to check. The hearing itself was set for late June, which left me the whole of a Kansas spring to keep building, and build I did, through days that turned warm enough to work in shirt sleeves and evenings when the mosquitoes off the creek nearly drove me back inside before the light failed. I finished the fence line proper on the 22nd of May, standing at the last corner post with my hands more calloused than I had ever imagined a lady's hands becoming, and I did not celebrate exactly, because there was no one there to celebrate with, and because I understood the real test was still weeks off in a courtroom. But I walked the whole length of it that evening, 40 feet corrected and 3 acres reclaimed, and a dry well standing open at its center like a held breath, and I let myself feel, for the first time since the funeral, something that was not quite grief and was not quite triumph either, but sat somewhere patient and steady between the two. What none of us expected, not Coyle, not Penny's lawyer, and certainly not me, was that the fence itself would end up mattering as much in that courtroom as any document in my father's box. Coyle told me afterward that the turning moment came when Penny's own lawyer, trying to paint the boundary claim as opportunistic, a young widow grasping at land she had no history working, made the mistake of mentioning the fence dismissively, calling it flimsy work thrown up in a hurry by someone with no real stake in the ground. The judge, an older man named Hartwell who had farmed himself before the bench, claimed him, asked to see it before ruling, an unusual request that Coyle said he had never once witnessed in 15 years of practice. We drove out the following Tuesday, myself and Coyle and Hartwell, and, at some distance, Penny and his lawyer, and I watched the judge walk the entire length of that fence line on foot, testing posts with his hand the way my father used to test them, pushing against the corners to feel how deep they'd been set, running his thumb along the split cedar the way I had watched my own hands learn to do over 2 months of blistered patient work. He did not say much out there in the pasture. But back in his chambers 3 days later, his ruling included a line that Coyle read to me twice because he could hardly believe a judge had written it into an official record. That a fence built with this much evident care and by these methods was not the work of someone chasing an opportunity, but the work of someone who intended to stay, and that intent, in his judgment, spoke louder than any lawyer's argument about whose name had sat longest on a tax roll. The ruling came down in my favor on the 9th of June, the boundary corrected exactly as the 1889 marker, and every piece of evidence since had said it should be. The 3 acres and the well returned to the Rourke name after more than 2 decades of quiet, unquestioned use by a neighbor who had simply counted on nobody caring enough to look. What the county did not know yet, what I had told no one but Coyle under strict confidence pending the ruling, was what that vein my great-grandfather had once had assayed might still hold, and I want to say plainly that even after the well was legally mine again, I did not rush down into it looking for silver. I went back to my fence instead, because May had brought something the whole county had genuinely not anticipated, a string of hard spring windstorms rolling up off the plains one after another, the kind that had in past years flattened weaker fence lines and scoured topsoil clean off unprotected fields for a mile in every direction. My father's orchard, 11 apple trees planted by his own father along the eastern edge of that corrected boundary, trees my brothers had written off years ago as too old to matter and had never once bothered to protect, stood directly in the path of those storms, and my fence, the one built from 200 frost-split posts everyone in this county had called worthless kindling the previous fall, held. Not because cedar split by frost is stronger than whole cedar, which it plainly is not, but because I had set every post nearly twice as deep as county custom called for, packed the earth in layers the way my father's ledger described a windbreak needing to be built rather than a simple pasture fence, and spaced them close enough that the line itself broke the worst of the wind before it ever reached the trees. The orchard bloomed that May behind my fence, while Hollis Deaver's own newer, straighter fence 2 farms over lay flattened in 3 places, and word of that particular irony moved through the county faster than any courtroom ruling ever could have. Everett came out to see the orchard himself in the last week of May, driving up unannounced in the truck he had inherited along with the good bottomland, and I watched him from the porch as he walked the fence line the same slow, testing way Judge Hartwell had, running his hand along posts he had once told me wouldn't survive a single hard wind. He did not apologize, not directly, because that was never his way, and I had not expected it to become his way, simply because circumstances had shifted beneath him. What he did instead was stand at the edge of the orchard for a long while, looking at 11 blooming apple trees that by every account should have been stripped bare by the storms that had just passed, and ask me, in a voice quieter than I had heard him use since before our father's illness, how I had known to set the posts that deep. I told him the truth, that I hadn't known, not at first, that I had only been following what our father's own handplane and whetstone seemed to be teaching me, without either of us saying so directly, and that the depth had come less from planning than from a kind of stubbornness that refused to do the work twice. He was quiet after that, and before he left he asked, almost as an afterthought, whether I might need help come harvest, an offer that would have felt like charity in October and felt, in that particular May light with the orchard blooming behind us, like something closer to an apology dressed in practical clothes. I told him I would let him know. I was not yet ready to forgive the ease with which my whole family had assumed the worst of what our father had left me, but I found, standing there watching my brother study a fence he had once mocked, that I no longer needed his forgiveness or his apology either, only his eventual understanding, and that understanding, unlike the good bottomland he'd claimed without a second thought, was arriving on its own patient schedule. I did eventually go back down into that well, in the last week of June after the ruling was final and the county records corrected and filed, and I brought with me this time not a lantern alone, but a proper sample bag and the address of an assay office in Wichita, the same city, though not the same office, my great-grandfather had corresponded with more than 70 years before. What I chipped from the exposed rock at the well's base and sent off in a small canvas sack was, according to the letter that came back 6 weeks later, not a rich vein by any modern industrial measure, not the kind of discovery that makes a person wealthy overnight, the way stories sometimes promise. But it was real, a modest seam of silver-bearing ore running through that low corner exactly as the old assay letters had described, worth enough, once I understood what I was looking at, to mean I would never again have to wonder whether Aunt Ruth's spare room above the dry goods store was a fate I might eventually be forced back toward. I did not tell the county what the letter said, and I have still, to this day, told only a handful of people the full truth of what sits at the bottom of that well, because I had learned by then, watching how quickly a story like Rourke's Folly could spread through every kitchen and feed store for 20 miles, how little privacy a person is allowed once their business becomes everyone's entertainment. What I did instead, quietly, without announcement, was hire 2 men from town to help me build a proper cap over the well, sturdier than Penny's old boards, and to plant along the new corrected boundary line a second row of trees behind my windbreak fence, young ones this time, meant to grow tall long after I was gone, the way my great-grandfather's apple trees had outlived every person who ever doubted they'd bear fruit again. People still call it Rourke's Folly sometimes, mostly old-timers who remember the story secondhand and enjoy the irony of the name more than they ever cared about its accuracy, and I have stopped correcting them because I understand now that the name was never really about the fence or the well or the 3 acres at all. It was about a room full of people deciding, in under an hour on a cold November afternoon, what a young woman was and was not capable of holding on to, and I have come to think my father understood that room better than any of us gave him credit for. Understood that a lawyer's letter or a sudden announcement of silver would have been fought and doubted and eventually taken from me by some means or another, the way things are so often taken from women, left alone in a county that measures worth by what a person is seen defending with their own hands. What he left me instead was work, patient and unglamorous and entirely mine, 200 posts nobody else wanted enough to steal, a puzzle slow enough that by the time anyone thought to contest what I was building, I had already built it too deep and too well to be easily undone. The orchard still stands behind that windbreak, 40-some years grown now, and every May when it blooms I walk the fence line the way Judge Hartwell once did, testing the old corner posts with my hand out of habit more than necessity, and I think about a man who spent the last breath of his failing lungs teaching his daughter to read wood the way he read it. Not because he expected her to find silver, though I believe some part of him hoped she might, but because he understood that the surest inheritance a person can leave behind is not land or money at all, but the plain, stubborn patience to keep working at something everyone else has already decided is worthless, until the day it quietly proves them wrong.